Thank you to Priya and the rest of the family for inviting me. I'm very honoured today to be giving the C.J. Thamotheram Memorial Lecture, who's a well-known and well-respected figure in the Tamil community and an important activist in the diaspora, who started many important projects, and some of which have also inspired the work of the generation of activists that I belong to. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Sri Lanka, the political situation in Sri Lanka, about, to some extent, also the role of India, but I'll also discuss the past and present role of the diaspora in Sri Lanka's ongoing ethnic conflict. And given Mr. Thamotheram's role in diaspora activism and in raising awareness about the situation in Sri Lanka, as a person living abroad, as a person living in the diaspora, I thought it would be fitting to bring those themes together. So, as we all know, Sri Lanka is a country where politics never stops, so there have been some very significant developments in the past few days, and I thought I would kind of end my talk by speaking about those developments and how the diaspora can play a role given the events that have been unfolding. So to begin with, the Tamil diaspora is a very significant presence now in Sri Lanka's politics. The Sri Lankan president, the current Sri Lankan president, Maithripala Sirisena, talked about the diaspora as a hotbed of separatist activity, says it has remnants of separatist activity. And the current draft of the Prevention of Terrorism Act in Sri Lanka talks about the possibility of allowing for the prosecution of foreign nationals of Sri Lankan descent for quote-unquote terrorist activity or the promotion of separatism. And they mean by that is they mean the possibility of targeting the Tamil diaspora. Mahinda and Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who are again prominent in Sri Lanka's politics and the events of the last week, whatever their official titles may be, we know that they're powerful people in the island's politics, also saw the diaspora as a really significant threat. So Gotabaya Rajapaksa, when he was the Defence Secretary of Sri Lanka, tried to prescribe or tried to prohibit Tamil diaspora organizations using UN legislation. So using the UN anti-terrorism legislation, one of the last things he did was try to prescribe a list of Tamil diaspora organizations through the UN Security Council. But interestingly, of course, that the countries in which the Tamil diaspora resides, the UK, Canada, Australia, refuse to recognize this. And it's not just, it's not just the Sri Lankan state, but also the Tamil people on the ground recognize the significance of the diaspora. So 10 years after the end of the war, what do we see on the ground in Sri Lanka in the Tamil-speaking areas? We see that the struggle is not over, the conflict is not over, but the struggle is also not over. There have been, for example, over 600 days of continuous protest by the mothers of the disappeared in Kilnochie and across other sites of the northeast. All over the northeast, mothers of the disappeared, displaced people, fishing people are staging continuous protests to reclaim their rights. There are also, as we speak, ongoing attempts by communities, by local people to organize Mavir and Nal remembrance events that are being, surveilled and repressed by the security forces. And the people on the ground also want the diaspora support and diaspora activism. I was very privileged recently in May this year to be on a panel in the EU Parliament buildings with a number of people from Sri Lanka, but also including one of the prominent leaders of the Mothers of the Disappeared in Kilnochie. And she was very clear about the role that the diaspora had to play. She says, you are here all the time. I only come here once in a while, but you can be here, you can speak on our behalf. And she has some English, she's mainly a Tamil speaker, she has some English. She wrote a speech in Tamil, she asked us to translate it into English so she could speak to people. And she wanted us to continue speaking on her behalf as she went back to continue her protests on the ground. And it's important to remember that, before the US elections in 2016, those momentous US elections when Donald Trump got elected as president, there were people on the ground in Jaffna and other parts of the northeast in the Tamil-speaking areas who, we saw it reported in the news, who were holding pujas and breaking coconuts and praying for Hillary Clinton to win, as were many people across the world. So what does this tell us? This tells us that the people on the ground in Sri Lanka, they understand the ways in which their local struggle is connected to global events, and they see the diaspora as having an important role in making their local struggle globally effective. Another important point about the diaspora is that the financial contribution that it makes to Sri Lanka. So it's an interesting thing about Sri Lanka that although we often talk about Sri Lanka being sort of trying to generate a kind of presence as an exporting nation and investment and foreign direct investment, Sri Lanka actually has a negative trade balance, so it imports more than it exports, okay? So it has a negative trade balance of about $9 billion. Tourism, which is a way of Sri Lanka making money, contributes about $4 billion. The most important source of foreign exchange for Sri Lanka, the most important way that Sri Lanka earns money from the rest of the world is through remittances, okay? The type of money that Sri Lankans, Tamils and Sinhalese people living abroad send back home. It's the most important way that Sri Lanka earns money from abroad. So that's $7 billion every year that Sri Lanka earns from remittances. Now the important thing about this is that the Tamils contribute a big chunk of those remittances. Some of those remittances are produced by Sinhalese people working, women and men working in the Middle East, but a big chunk is also produced by the Tamil diaspora. So for example, in 2016, the Tamil diaspora in the UK sent back about $530 million, right? The Tamil diaspora in Canada sent back about $450 million. Okay, so overall, that's $1 billion from the Tamil diaspora going to Sri Lanka. That's a structurally significant part of the economy. Okay? And also, if you think about it, where does that money go? It helps to keep people alive, fed, housed across the northeast and in Colombo. So the Tamil diaspora might be off the island, but financially, economically, they're absolutely crucial to Sri Lanka's economy, and particularly the economy of the northeast. So, given that background, the significance of the Tamil diaspora, I'm going to talk about the type of changes that it's been through and the type of impact it can have going forward. And one of the things I want to point out, the question I'm often asked is, why are people who are living so far away from the island, why are they involved in the island's politics? Well, the engagement of the Tamil diaspora with Sri Lanka's politics is by no means, in comparative scale, unique. Politics of all kinds of struggles across time, across space and history have always had a transnational connection. That is, people from all over the world have worked together to struggle to advance the cause of oppressed people, different places at different times. So to give you some examples, the Indian nationalist movement, the Indian anti-colonial movement, which we all famously associate with Gandhi, also had a really important global dimension. One of the first acts of the Indian nationalist movement was to get an Indian called Dadabhai Naoroji elected to the UK Parliament in 1892 as a way of advancing the cause for Indian self-rule. And then later, of course, Indian migrant workers in California, in Canada, worked to advance the cause of Indian self-rule in the early part of the 20th century. Also, we can think of the anti-apartheid struggle. The anti-apartheid struggle was led by people in South Africa, but also, crucially, had a massive global dimension. Right? It involved South African dissidents who were living and studying abroad, campaigning on behalf of the anti-apartheid movement, and it also involved activists from all over the world coming together to push against apartheid. The Zionist movement that led to the founding of Israel was a transnational movement. The Irish Republican movement, also a transnational movement, started by sailors working on ships. Likewise, we can think of the current Palestinian movement, again, global movement. So the Tamil diaspora movement is not by any means kind of unique or peculiar to Sri Lanka. So what impact has the Tamil diaspora had on Sri Lanka's politics? So before I get to that, and before I get to thinking about what impact the Tamil diaspora can have in Sri Lanka's kind of current conjecture, it's important to understand, I think, the context in which the diaspora has worked throughout the past kind of 40 to 50 years, and the way in which this context has started to change. So the first thing I think to bear in mind is that the international context in which the Tamil diaspora has worked from the 1960s onwards, the 1960s to 1970s, is an international context that has generally favoured the state, the Sri Lankan state. So the international dimension has generally worked in support of the Sri Lankan state and against those who are trying to make the state change, including Tamil political activists in Sri Lanka and overseas. So if we think about the Cold War era, the Cold War ended in 1990, but it really dominated 20th century politics. It really dominated the time in which Tamil militancy first started, and Tamil politics and the Tamil kind of demand for self-determination also started to gain ground. So during the Cold War, and particularly from 1977, Sri Lanka became one of the crucial allies of the US, right? It became one of the crucial kind of allies of the West in the West's then struggle against communist rule. And so from 1977 onwards, you can see that Sri Lanka started to receive massive amounts of international support, military support and political support. So a key example of this is an event that some of you may know, some of you may even remember, some of you may even have lived through, which is the 1983 riot. Certainly, I was in Sri Lanka as a small child at the time, and it's part of my family's kind of collective memory. The year after the 1983 riot, when there was this massive violence on the streets of Colombo and elsewhere on the island, including the complicity by the state, the following year, the president of Sri Lanka, J.R. Jayawardeneh, is hosted to a reception in the White House by the President of the United States, President Reagan at the time. Why is this? The context of the Cold War. So even though the diaspora has been active throughout these decades, including people like Mr. Thamotheram setting up institutions, it often seems that it doesn't make much headway, and there's a kind of global context to this. Okay, so first of all, there was the Cold War. Then the Cold War ended in 1990. And still, the global context generally favoured the state against the Tamils. So, Cold War ended in 1990, but what you would see from 1990 onwards is you would see continued kind of levels of international support for the Sri Lankan state, military support, political support, diplomatic support for the Sri Lankan state against, at the time, the main Tamil political grouping, the LTTE. And in part, this was fueled by the belief that although the international community wanted the conflict to end, there was a kind of belief that the Sri Lankan state was a good, liberal state in the making. It wanted to be a good, liberal, inclusive state in the making. And the only real problem that was standing in the way was the LTTE. So the Sri Lankan state, and this is important to understanding the current crisis, the Sri Lankan state has always had this sort of split personality. It's like a Jekyll and Hyde figure. So on the one hand, on the domestic side, the Sri Lankan state is very much a singular Buddhist state, where the powerful Buddhist monks, the singular majority is important, and the character of the state is very much a singular Buddhist state, and the minorities are sort of kept in their place. On the international level, though, it's presented another face. The international level, it's presented itself as a democracy. It's a good, liberal democracy, market democracy. That's how the leaders speak. So when Jayawardeneh went to the White House in 1984, he said, "We are a five-star democracy," having just had these terrible riots just a year before. Okay, so it's always had this sort of split personality. One domestic personality, one international personality. And on the whole, international actors have generally believed the international personality for different reasons. One key reason is, of course, that there have always been leaders, Tamil-speaking leaders in Colombo, who have been willing to say, yes, this is a good liberal state, we believe in this state, we can work with this state, it's the LTT that's the problem. So that's always been a dynamic. So throughout the Cold War, this was the dynamic that helped fuel the conflict and in which the diaspora existed and had to do its work. And this also informed the Norwegian peace process. The Norwegian peace process was an attempt to bring a kind of negotiated settlement to the conflict between the Sri Lankan state and the LTTE. But the overarching kind of framework was that this, the conflict was really something that was driven by the armed violence of the LTTE and its pursuit of a separatist agenda, and if the LTT went away, then the state would be able to resolve the problem by itself. The state wanted to resolve the problem, and if the LTT disappeared, the state would be able to resolve the problem. Okay, And so this brings us back to the present. So in 2005, when this man called Mahinda Rajapaksa first becomes a powerful person in Sri Lanka's politics and becomes a presidential candidate, on a very quite hardline singular nationalist platform, he also played this game a little bit initially. He said, yes, I want to resolve the conflict, I want to have a solution, I want to, have some constitutional solution for the problem, but I need to defeat the LTT first. So in 2005, when Rajapaksa came to power for the first time, people believed him. And there were also lots of Tamil political leaders in Colombo who supported that line in private, if not in public. And so this was the reason that, Rajapaksa's kind of military campaign against the LTT had international support, got international backing, and led in 2009, we're coming up to the 10th anniversary, led to the defeat of the LTT in 2009. So we're now in the kind of the third, I think, international context, and this is where the diaspora's role, I think, can be significant and important. So we had a context of the Cold War, we had the context of the post-Cold War era. We're now living in what might be called the post-LTT era. And the interesting thing about the post-LTT era is that the division between Sri Lanka's international face and its domestic face is clear to everybody. And there's no longer the excuse of the LTT to explain why Sri Lankan leaders cannot implement the reforms they have been promising the international for several decades. So this is a moment of opportunity, and this is a point at which the diaspora can play an effective role in mobilizing international pressure and in mobilizing international support. So when the representatives of the Mothers of the Disappeared say to diaspora activists, you have a voice, you have a role, you have to act, they're onto something. Okay, so bearing this in mind, it's important to think about the history of diaspora activism, this moment when the international context has changed in a way that's favorable to diaspora activism. So just to give you some background, diaspora activism, particularly in the UK, which is where we are, which is where a lot of Mr. Thamotharam's work took place, has long roots. It goes back a long, long time. And it started actually in the 1960s. So I don't know if any of you know this name, but there was a Tamil leader in the 1960s called S.J.V. Chelvanayam, and he led a kind of civil resistance movement for Tamil language rights in Sri Lanka, which ultimately failed. It was a massive movement, massive popular participation. They brought the administration in Jaffna, the north and east, to a complete standstill through this civil disobedience, like the Gandhian strategy, by just sitting down, occupying buildings until someone would listen to them. And he was an elderly man, he had Parkinson's disease, and while he was in house arrest, he needed urgent treatment. The Sri Lankan government, under some international pressure, Sri Lankan government of Srimavo Bandaranaike at the time, under some international pressure, agreed to let him leave the island and come to the UK to see his physician, to seek treatment for his Parkinson's disease. But they put one condition, and the one condition was that as he travelled out to the UK, as he came to the UK to seek treatment, he mustn't meet with the Tamil diaspora, who had been mobilizing pressure here against the Sri Lankan state. So you can see that it goes way, way back. And then in the 1960s, 1970s, this continuous pressure, despite the fact that this international climate was so difficult, the pressure was just kept going. And it had some impact on the Sri Lankan state. So for example, in the 1980s, as I mentioned, during the Cold War, when Sri Lanka was receiving all of this military, diplomatic, economic assistance from Western states, UK, US, Canada, we have we have reports of Sri Lankan government ministers coming to the UK and asking their British counterparts for assistance in clamping down on Tamil diaspora activities. And what they were talking about was the types of mobilization that activists were involved in at the time, including in that decade the setting up of Tamil Times, which was the first sort of diaspora Tamil publication in the UK. Actually, it was global, it was shipped globally. My parents lived in Nigeria for a while, and we received it there. So they wanted assistance in clamping down on this type of activism because it was having an effect on the Sri Lankan state, despite the fact that the state is relatively very powerful and the international context is also one that supports the state. And then in the 1990s and the 2000s, as the Civil War unfolded and as the Civil War became militarized, and in the context of the war on terror at the time, this activism continued. And in particular for me and the people, the generation of activists that I'm from, this was the period in which the internet became significant as a space in which Tamil activism expanded. So things like Tamilnet, Tamil Guardian, all these entities emerged and started to take up space. And also, of course, then as the war unfolded in 2009, we had the mass protests, unprecedented mass protests in the UK, in Canada, the occupation of Parliament Square for 70 days that just really captured international attention. And so, but what effect did these have? You know, a cynic might say, well, this didn't really change anything on the ground. It didn't really affect the Sri Lankan state in any way. But I would disagree, because I think that activism across those years had some significant impact. So, particularly towards the end of the war, the sustained activism through the internet, the mass protests really changed the narrative of what the end of the war was about. For the Sri Lankan state, the end of the war was supposed to be a kind of glorious victory against separatism, against terrorism. That's how we were supposed to remember the end of the war, and that's how the international community was also expected to kind of greet the end of the war. But actually what happened is the sustained activity meant that the end of the war became remembered or became understood largely, commonsensically, as an absolute humanitarian disaster, as a site of war crimes, potentially crimes against humanity, and even increasingly people are talking about it in the terms of this was a kind of a genocidal onslaught. So since that point, Tamil diaspora activism in these different veins has come up to a sort of fairly powerful and significant place. Starting from the 1960s, when there were just a few people who were trying to lobby their MPs, and through the 70s and the 80s, it's come up to a fairly kind of powerful place. So if you think where it is now and the types of things can be achieved, there are now very significant and powerful kind of Tamil political lobbies within the two main political parties in the UK, within the Labour Party and within the Conservative Party. So, for example, Jeremy Corbyn is the leader of the Labour Party, very clear and unequivocal positions on the Tamil issue. This didn't happen by accident. Jeremy Corbyn's kind of involvement with the Tamil issue started back really in the late 70s, early 80s. He was coming to marches that Tamils were organising in the early 1980s, as was Diane Abbott. So the types of links that were put in place by people several decades ago are the types of links that are powerful and useful now. Likewise with the Conservative Party, the British Tamil Conservatives are one of the largest kind of groupings within the Conservative Party, and one of my sort of long-time friends and colleagues, fellow activist who works with the British Tamil Conservatives, tells me that the fringe event that the British Tamil Conservatives organise at the Conservative Party conference is extremely well attended and is only kind of like it's only second to the fringe event organised by the Conservative Friends of Israel. So that's it's a powerful place to be, having started only a few years ago. So this is these decades of activism, this political kind of mobilizations, political significance, has built up some important and useful capital at a time when the international context has also changed in a way that is not as conducive to the Sri Lankan state as it once was. Because at the end of the Cold War, in the absence of an armed conflict, the contradiction between Sri Lanka's international promises and its domestic reforms have come to bear. It can no longer have these two separate faces. It has to explain why it's not implementing the reforms that it has promised to do for so long. And I think this is where the diaspora has an important role to play. because the types of demands that people are making on the ground, activists, you know, as we speak, as we sit here, there are people on the streets in Kulnochi, in Jaffna, in Trincomalee. There are ongoing struggles, there are ongoing campaigns for land, for their loved ones, you know, people, mothers have disappeared. You took my child, where is he or she? Tell me. These kinds of struggles, ongoing struggles that are happening now. These kinds of demands for the demilitarization of the Northeast. If any of you have been to Sri Lanka lately, and you've been to Jaffna, and you've travelled across the Valley, you see the enormous military presence across those areas. Enormous military presence. So the military to civilian ratio across the Northeast is extremely high. There is one Sri Lankan soldier for every 3 civilians. That is one of the highest ratios anywhere in the world. It's unimaginably high military to civilian ratio. So these kinds of demands that people are making on the ground, these eminently reasonable, sensible demands that are crucial, that have to be met if Sri Lanka is to meet its international obligations, but are also crucial and have to be met if life for people on the ground is going to return to any kind of normalcy. These kinds of demands are, I think, the place where the diaspora has a really crucial role, but also has the resources to be able to act that role in pushing forward these demands. And particularly, given this sort of these connections and this weight that there is between the 2 main political parties in the UK and the Tamil presence. So, given that's the context, you know, the events of the last few days have been very dramatic. And, you know, from what I can tell from reading the press also, yet to be unresolved. So how do we explain this? How do we explain the sudden return of Rajapaksa, the crisis-ridden nature of the Sri Lankan state, the inability of Sri Lankan political leaders to come to any kind of consensus, and the way in which a state that has been a fairly functional democracy for several decades has reached this kind of impasse? Well, one way to think about it is to think about it in terms of this contradiction between the international and the domestic. Rajapaksa was an extremely popular domestic leader amongst the Sinhalese. He was extremely popular. He remains extremely popular. Even when he lost in 2015 to Sirisena, he still won the majority of the Sinhala vote. He still won the vast majority of the Sinhala vote. He's an extremely popular leader. But he lost because the Sri Lankan state struggled to maintain that kind of contradiction between its domestic realities and international demands. Mounting international pressure was the reason that there was a sort of soft regime change in Sri Lanka in 2015, that a sort of more acceptable figure was brought to the fore. One who was not hugely popular amongst the Sinhalese, but sort of had some support amongst the minorities, and one who could seem to, at the time anyway, to be able to deliver some of the key demands the international community, primarily Western states and also India to some extent, were making. But this pressure is also, this contradiction is also difficult to manage, because while the new president and the new government tried to make small steps to meet international demands, very, very small steps, and nowhere near as the types of steps that they promised, even this was too much. And the return or the re-rise of Rajapaksa is really about the kind of the coming to fore of that domestic popular support that he always had. The domestic kind of agenda of a Sinhala Buddhist state, the Sinhala Buddhist people in which the minorities are to be subordinate. And that's the contradiction. That's the big contradiction. It's a contradiction between the international and the domestic. And what's very interesting and very kind of as a political scientist, very interesting for me now, is that this the international that Sri Lanka faces, the international pressure that it faces, has the diaspora embedded in it. The diaspora is now a crucial part of the international that the Sri Lankan state has to face. And having this role gives the diaspora both possibilities and the opportunity of working in ways that can alleviate conditions for people on the ground.